Chapter 22. Mrs. Morse did not require a mother's intuition to read the advertisement in Ruth's face when she returned home. The flush that would not leave the cheeks told the simple story, and more eloquently did the eyes, large and bright, reflecting an unmistakable inward glory. "What has happened?" Mrs. Morse asked, having bided her time till Ruth had gone to bed. "You know?" Ruth queried, with trembling lips. For reply, her mother's arm went around her, and a hand was softly caressing her hair. "He did not speak," she blurted out. "I did not intend that it should happen, and I would never have let him speak. Only he did speak." "But if he did not speak, then nothing could have happened, could it?" "But it did, just the same." "In the name of goodness, child, what are you babbling about?" Mrs. Morse was bewildered. "I don't think I know what happened after all. What did happen?" Ruth looked at her mother in surprise. "I thought you knew. Why, we're engaged, Martin and I." Mrs. Morse laughed with incredulous vexation. "No, he didn't speak," Ruth explained. "He just loved me. That was all. I was as surprised as you are. He didn't say a word. He just put his arm around me, and I was not myself. And he kissed me, and I kissed him. I couldn't help it. I just had to. And then I knew I loved him." She paused, waiting with expectancy the benediction of her mother's kiss. But Mrs. Morse was coldly silent. "It is a dreadful accident, I know," Ruth recommenced with a sinking voice. "And I don't know how you'll ever forgive me. But I couldn't help it. I did not dream that I loved him until that moment. And you must tell father for me." "Would it not be better not to tell your father? Let me see Martin Eden and talk with him and explain. He will understand and release you." "No, no," Ruth cried, starting up. "I do not want to be released. I love him, and love is very sweet. I am going to marry him, of course, if you will let me." "We have other plans for you, Ruth dear, your father and I. Oh, no man picked out for you or anything like that. Our plans go no farther than you marrying some man in your own station in life, a good and honourable gentleman whom you will select yourself when you love him." "But I love Martin already," was the plaintive protest. "We would not influence your choice in any way, but you are our daughter, and we could not bear to see you make a marriage such as this. He has nothing but roughness and coarseness to offer you in exchange for all that is refined and delicate in you. He is no match for you in any way. He could not support you. We have no foolish ideas about wealth, but comfort is another matter, and our daughter should at least marry a man who can give her that, and not a penniless adventurer, a sailor, a cowboy, a smuggler, and heaven knows what else, who, in addition to everything, is harebrained and irresponsible." Ruth was silent. Every word she recognized as true. "He wastes his time over his writing, trying to accomplish what geniuses and rare men with college educations sometimes accomplish. A man thinking of marriage should be preparing for marriage, but not he. As I have said, and I know you agree with me, he is irresponsible. And why should he not be? It is the way of sailors. He has never learned to be economical or temperate. The spendthrift years have marked him. It is not his fault, of course, but that does not alter his nature. And have you thought of the years of licentiousness he inevitably has lived? Have you thought of that, daughter? You know what marriage means." Ruth shuddered and clung close to her mother. "I have thought." Ruth waited a long time for the thought to frame itself. "And it is terrible. It sickens me to think of it. I told you it was a dreadful accident, my loving him, but I can't help myself. Could you help loving father?" then it is the same with me. There is something in me, in him. I never knew it was there until today, but it is there, and it makes me love him. I never thought to love him, but, you see, I do." She concluded, a certain faint triumph in her voice. They talked long and to little purpose in conclusion, agreeing to wait an indeterminate time without doing anything. The same conclusion was reached a little later that night between Mrs. Morse and her husband, after she had made due confession of the miscarriage of her plans. "It could hardly have come otherwise," was Mr. Morse's judgment. "This sailor fellow has been the only man she was in touch with. Sooner or later she was going to awaken anyway, and she did awaken. And lo, here was this sailor fellow, the only accessible man at the moment, and of course she promptly loved him, or thought she did, which amounts to the same thing." Mrs. Morse took it upon herself to work slowly and indirectly upon Ruth, rather than to combat her. There would be plenty of time for this, for Martin was not in position to marry. "Let her see all she wants of him," was Mr. Morse's advice. "The more she knows him, the less she'll love him, I wager. And give her plenty of contrast. Make a point of having young people at the house. Young women and young men. All sorts of young men. Clever men. Men who have done something, or who are doing things. Men of her own class. Gentlemen. She can gauge him by them. They will show him up for what he is. And after all, he is a mere boy of 21. Ruth is no more than a child. It is calf love with the pair of them, and they will grow out of it." So the matter rested. Within the family it was accepted that Ruth and Martin were engaged, but no announcement was made. The family did not think it would ever be necessary. Also, it was tactically understood that it was to be a long engagement. They did not ask Martin to go to work, nor to cease writing. They did not intend to encourage him to mend himself, and he aided and abetted them in their unfriendly designs, for going to work was farthest from his thoughts. "I wonder if you'll like what I have done," he said to Ruth several days later. "I've decided that boarding with my sister is too expensive, and I am going to board myself. I've rented a little room out in North Oakland, retired neighborhood and all the rest, you know, and I've bought an oil burner on which to cook." Ruth was overjoyed. The oil burner especially pleased her. "That was the way Mr. Butler began his start," she said. Martin frowned inwardly at the citation of that worthy gentleman, and went on. "I put stamps on all my manuscripts and started them off to the editors again. Then today I moved in, and tomorrow I start to work." "A position!" she cried, betraying the gladness of her surprise in all her body, nestling closer to him, pressing his hand, smiling. "And you never told me. What is it?" He shook his head. "I meant that I was going to work at my writing." Her face fell, and he went on hastily. "Don't misjudge me. I am not going in this time with my iridescent ideas. It is to be a cold, prosaic, matter-of-fact business proposition. It is better than going to sea again, and I shall earn more money than any position in Oakland can bring an unskilled man. You see, this vacation I have taken has given me perspective. I haven't been working the life out of my body, and I haven't been writing, at least not for publication. All I've done has been to love you and to think. I've read some, too, but it has been part of my thinking, and I have read principally magazines. I have generalized about myself and the world, my place in it, and my chance to win a place that will be fit for you. Also, I've been reading Spencer's Philosophy of Style, and found out a lot of what was the matter with me, or my writing, rather, and for that matter, with most of the writing that is published every month in the magazines. But the upshot of it all, of my thinking and reading and loving, is that I am going to move to Grub Street. I shall leave masterpieces alone and do hack work. jokes, paragraphs, feature articles, humorous verse and society verse, all the rot for which there seems so much demand. Then there are the newspaper syndicates, and the newspaper short story syndicates, and the syndicates for the Sunday supplements. I can go ahead and hammer out the stuff they want and earn the equivalent of a good salary by it. There are freelancers, you know, who earn as much as $400 or $500 a month. I don't care to become as they, but I'll earn a good living and have plenty of time to myself, which I wouldn't have in any position. Then I'll have my spare time for study and for real work. In between the grind, I'll try my hand at masterpieces, and I'll study and prepare myself for the writing of masterpieces. Why, I am amazed at the distance I have come already. When I first tried to write, I had nothing to write about, except a few paltry experiences which I neither understood nor appreciated. But I had no thoughts. I really didn't. I didn't even have the words with which to think. My experiences were so many meaningless pictures. But as I began to add to my knowledge and to my vocabulary, I saw something more in my experiences than mere pictures. I retained the pictures, and I found their interpretation. That was when I began to do good work, when I wrote adventure, joy, the pot, the wine of life, the jostling street, the love cycle, and the sea lyrics. I shall write more like them, and better, but I shall do it in my spare time. My feet are on the solid earth now. Hack work and income first, masterpieces afterward. Just to show you, I wrote half a dozen jokes last night for the comic weeklies, and just as I was going to bed, the thought struck me to try my hand at a triolet, a humorous one, and inside an hour I had written 4. They ought to be worth $1 apiece. $4 right there for a few afterthoughts on the way to bed. Of course it's all valueless, just so much dull and sordid plotting, but it is no more dull and sordid than keeping books at $60 a month, adding up endless columns of meaningless figures until one dies. And furthermore, the hack work keeps me in touch with things literary and gives me time to try bigger things. "But what good are these bigger things, these masterpieces?" Ruth demanded. "You can't sell them." "Oh, yes, I can," he began, but she interrupted. "All those you named, and which you say yourself are good, you have not sold any of them. We can't get married on masterpieces that won't sell." "Then we'll get married on triolets that will sell," he asserted stoutly, putting his arm around her and drawing a very unresponsive sweetheart toward him. "Listen to this," he went on in an attempted gaiety. "It's not art, but it's $1. He came in when I was out. To borrow some tin was why he came in, and when he went without, so I was in and he was out." The merry lilt with which he had invested the jingle was at variance with the dejection that came into his face as he finished. He had drawn no smile from Ruth. She was looking at him with an earnest and troubled way. "It may be $1, she said, "but it's a jester's dollar, the fee for a clown. Don't you see, Martin? The whole thing is lowering. I want the man I love and honor to be something finer and higher than a perpetrator of jokes and doggerel." "You want him to be like, say, Mr. Butler?" he suggested. "I know you don't like Mr. Butler," she began. "Mr. Butler's all right," he interrupted. "It's only his indigestion I find fault with. But to save me, I can't see any difference between writing jokes or comic verse and running a typewriter, taking dictation, or keeping sets of books. It is all a means to an end. Your theory is for me to begin with keeping books in order to become a successful lawyer or man of business. Mine is to begin with hack work and develop into an able author." "There is a difference," she insisted. "What is it?" "Why, your good work, what you yourself call good, you can't sell. You have tried, you know that, but the editors won't buy it." "Give me time, dear," he pleaded. "The hack work is only makeshift, and I don't take it seriously. Give me 2 years. I shall succeed in that time, and the editors will be glad to buy my good work. I know what I am saying. I have faith in myself. I know what I have in me. I know what literature is now. I know the average rot that is poured out by a lot of little men, and I know that at the end of 2 years I shall be on the high road to success. As for business, I shall never succeed at it. I am not in sympathy with it. It strikes me as dull and stupid and mercenary and tricky. Anyway, I am not adapted for it. I'd never get beyond a clerkship, and how could you and I be happy on the paltry earnings of a clerk? I want the best of everything in the world for you, and the only time when I won't want it will be when there is something better. And I'm going to get it, going to get all of it. The income of a successful author makes Mr. Butler look cheap. A bestseller will earn anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000. Sometimes more and sometimes less, but as a rule, pretty close to those figures. She remained silent. Her disappointment was apparent. "Well?" he asked. "I had hoped and planned otherwise. I had thought, and I still think, that the best thing for you would be to study shorthand. You already know typewriting, and go into Father's office. You have a good mind, and I am confident you would succeed as a lawyer." Chapter 23. That Ruth had little faith in his power as a writer did not alter her, nor diminish her in Martin's eyes. In the breathing spell of the vacation he had taken, he had spent many hours in self-analysis, and thereby learned much of himself. He had discovered that he loved beauty more than fame, and that what desire he had for fame was largely for Ruth's sake. It was for this reason that his desire for fame was strong. He wanted to be great in the world's eyes, to make good, as he expressed it, in order that the woman he loved should be proud of him and deem him worthy. As for himself, he loved beauty passionately, and the joy of serving her was to him sufficient wage. And more than beauty, he loved Ruth. He considered love the finest thing in the world. It was love that had worked the revolution in him, changing him from an uncouth sailor to a student and an artist. Therefore, to him, the finest and greatest of the three, greater than learning and artistry, was love. Already he had discovered that his brain went beyond Ruth's, just as it went beyond the brains of her brothers, or the brain of her father. In spite of every advantage of university training, and in the face of her bachelorship of arts, his power of intellect overshadowed hers, and his year or so of self-study and equipment gave him a mastery of the affairs of the world and art and life that she could never hope to possess. All this he realized, but it did not affect his love for her, nor her love for him. Love was too fine and noble, and he was too loyal a lover for him to besmirch love with criticism. What did love have to do with Ruth's divergent views on art, right conduct, the French Revolution, or equal suffrage? They were mental processes, but love was beyond reason. It was super-rational. He could not belittle love. He worshipped it. Love lay on the mountain-tops beyond the valley land of reason. It was a sublimate condition of existence, the topmost peak of living, and it came rarely. Thanks to the school of scientific philosophers he favoured, he knew the biological significance of love. But by a refined process of the same scientific reasoning, he reached the conclusion that the human organism achieved its highest purpose in love. That love must not be questioned, but must be accepted as the highest guerdon of life. Thus he considered the lover blessed over all creatures, and it was a delight to him to think of God's own mad lover rising above the things of earth, above wealth and judgment, public opinion and applause, rising above life itself and dying on a kiss. Much of this Martin had already reasoned out, and some of it he reasoned out later. In the meantime, he worked, taking no recreation except when he went to see Ruth, and living like a Spartan. He paid $2.50 a month rent for the small room he got from his Portuguese landlady, Maria Silva, a virago and a widow, hard-working and harsher-tempered, rearing her large brood of children somehow, and drowning her sorrow and fatigue at irregular intervals in a gallon of the thin, sour wine that she bought from the corner grocery and saloon for 15 cents. From detesting her and her foul tongue at first, Martin grew to admire her, as he observed the brave fight she made. There were but 4 rooms in the little house, 3 when Martin's was subtracted. One of these, the parlour, gay with an ingrain carpet and dolorous with a funeral card and a death picture of one of her numerous departed babes, was kept strictly for company. The blinds were always down, and her barefooted tribe was never permitted to enter the sacred precinct save on state occasions. She cooked, and all ate in the kitchen, where she likewise washed, starched, and ironed clothes on all days of the week except Sunday, for her income came largely from taking in washing from her more prosperous neighbours. Remained the bedroom, small as the one occupied by Martin, into which she and her 7 little ones crowded and slept. It was an everlasting miracle to Martin how it was accomplished, and from her side of the thin partition he heard nightly every detail of the going to bed, the squalls and squabbles, the soft chattering, and the sleepy, twittering noises as of birds. Another source of income to Maria were her cows, 2 of them, which she milked night and morning, and which gained a surreptitious livelihood from vacant lots and the grass that grew on either side the public sidewalks, attended always by 1 or more of her ragged boys, whose watchful guardianship consisted chiefly in keeping their eyes out for the poundmen. In his own small room, Martin lived, slept, studied, wrote, and kept house. Before the one window, looking out on the tiny front porch, was the kitchen table that served as a desk, library, and typewriting stand. The bed, against the rear wall, occupied 2/3 of the total space of the room. The table was flanked on one side by a gaudy bureau, manufactured for profit and not for service, the thin veneer of which was shed day by day. This bureau stood in the corner, and in the opposite corner, on the table's other flank, was the kitchen, the oil stove on a dry goods box, inside of which were dishes and cooking utensils, a shelf on the wall for provisions, and a bucket of water on the floor. Martin had to carry his water from the kitchen sink, there being no tap in his room. On days when there was much steam to his cooking, the harvest of veneer from the bureau was unusually generous. Over the bed, hoisted by a tackle to the ceiling, was his bicycle. At first he had tried to keep it in the basement, but the tribe of Silva, loosening the bearings and puncturing the tires, had driven him out. Next he attempted the tiny front porch, until a howling southeaster drenched the wheel a night long. Then he had retreated with it to his room and slung it aloft. A small closet contained his clothes and the books he had accumulated, and for which there was no room on the table or under the table. Hand in hand with reading, he had developed the habit of making notes, and so copiously did he make them that there would have been no existence for him in the confined quarters had he not rigged several clotheslines across the room on which the notes were hung. Even so, he was crowded until navigating the room was a difficult task. He could not open the door without first closing the closet door, and vice versa. It was impossible for him anywhere to traverse the room in a straight line. To go from the door to the head of the bed was a zigzag course that he was never quite able to accomplish in the dark without collisions. Having settled the difficulty of the conflicting doors, he had to steer sharply to the right to avoid the kitchen. Next, he sheered to the left to escape the foot of the bed, but this sheer, if too generous, brought him against the corner of the table. With a sudden twitch and lurch, he terminated the sheer and bore off to the right along a sort of canal, one bank of which was the bed, the other the table. When the one chair in the room was at its usual place before the table, the canal was unnavigable. When the chair was not in use, it reposed on top of the bed, though sometimes he sat on the chair when cooking, reading a book while the water boiled, and even becoming skillful enough to manage a paragraph or two while steak was frying. Also, so small was the little corner that constituted the kitchen, he was able, sitting down, to reach anything he needed. In fact, it was expedient to cook sitting down. Standing up, he was too often in his own way. In conjunction with a perfect stomach that could digest anything, he possessed knowledge of the various foods that were at the same time nutritious and cheap. Pea soup was a common article in his diet, as well as potatoes and beans, the latter large and brown and cooked in Mexican style. Rice, cooked as American housewives never cook it and can never learn to cook it, appeared on Martin's table at least once a day. Dried fruits were less expensive than fresh, and he had usually a pot of them, cooked and ready at hand, for they took the place of butter on his bread. Occasionally he graced his table with a piece of round steak, or with a soup bone. Coffee, without cream or milk, he had twice a day, in the evening substituting tea, but both coffee and tea were excellently cooked. There was need for him to be economical. His vacation had consumed nearly all he had earned in the laundry, and he was so far from his market that weeks must elapse before he could hope for the first returns from his hack work. Except at such times as he saw Ruth, or dropped in to see his sister Gertrude, he lived a recluse, in each day accomplishing at least 3 days' labour of ordinary men. He slept a scant 5 hours, and only one with a constitution of iron could have held himself down, as Martin did, day after day, to 19 consecutive hours of toil. He never lost a moment. On the looking-glass were lists of definitions and pronunciations. When shaving or dressing or combing his hair, he coned these lists over. Similar lists were on the wall over the oil stove, and they were similarly coned while he was engaged in cooking or in washing the dishes. New lists continually displaced the old ones. Every strange or partly familiar word encountered in his reading was immediately jotted down, and later, when a sufficient number had been accumulated, were typed and pinned to the wall or looking-glass. He even carried them in his pockets, and reviewed them at odd moments on the street or while waiting in butcher shop or grocery to be served. He went farther in the matter, reading the works of men who had arrived. He noted every result achieved by them, and worked out the tricks by which they had been achieved, the tricks of narrative, of exposition, of style, the points of view, the contrasts, the epigrams, and of all these he made lists for study. He did not ape, he sought principles. He drew up lists of effective and fetching mannerisms, till out of many such, culled from many writers, he was able to induce the general principle of mannerism, and, thus equipped, to cast about for new and original ones of his own, and to weigh and measure and appraise them properly. In similar manner, he collected lists of strong phrases, the phrases of living language, phrases that bit like acid and scorched like flame, or that glowed and were mellow and luscious in the midst of the arid desert of common speech. He sought always for the principle that lay behind and beneath. He wanted to know how the thing was done. After that, he could do it for himself. He was not content with the fair face of beauty. He dissected beauty in his crowded little bedroom laboratory, where cooking smells alternated with the outer bedlam of the silver tribe. And having dissected and learned the anatomy of beauty, he was nearer being able to create beauty itself. He was so made that he could work only with understanding. He could not work blindly, in the dark, ignorant of what he was producing, and trusting to chance and the star of his genius that the effect produced should be right and fine. He had no patience with chance effects. He wanted to know why and how. His was deliberate creative genius, and, before he began a story or poem, the thing itself was already alive in his brain, with the end in sight and the means of realizing that end in his conscious possession. Otherwise, the effect was doomed to failure. On the other hand, he appreciated the chance effects in words and phrases that came lightly and easily into his brain, and that later stood all the tests of beauty and power and developed tremendous and incommunicable connotations. Before such he bowed down and marvelled, knowing that they were beyond the deliberate creation of any man. And no matter how much he dissected beauty in search of the principles that underlie beauty and make beauty possible, he was aware always of the innermost mystery of beauty to which he did not penetrate and to which no man had ever penetrated. He knew full well from his Spencer that man can never attain ultimate knowledge of anything, and that the mystery of beauty was no less than that of life. Nay, more, that the fibres of beauty and life were intertwisted, and that he himself was but a bit of the same none-understandable fabric, twisted of sunshine and stardust and wonder. In fact, it was when filled with these thoughts that he wrote his essay entitled Stardust, in which he had his fling, not at the principles of criticism, but at the principal critics. It was brilliant, deep, philosophical, and deliciously touched with laughter. Also, it was promptly rejected by the magazines as often as it was submitted. But having cleared his mind of it, he went serenely on his way. It was a habit he developed of incubating and maturing his thought upon a subject, and of then rushing into the typewriter with it. That it did not see print was a matter of small moment with him. The writing of it was the culminating act of a long mental process, the drawing together of scattered threads of thought, and the final generalizing upon all the data with which his mind was burdened. To write such an article was the conscious effort by which he freed his mind and made it ready for fresh material and problems. It was in a way akin to that common habit of men and women troubled by real or fancied grievances, who periodically and volubly break their long-suffering silence and have their say till the last word is said. Chapter 24. The weeks passed. Martin ran out of money, and publishers' cheques were far away as ever. All his important manuscripts had come back and been started out again, and his hack work fared no better. His little kitchen was no longer graced with a variety of foods. Caught in the pinch with a part sack of rice and a few pounds of dried apricots, rice and apricots was his menu 3 times a day for 5 days hand-running. Then he started to realize on his credit. The Portuguese grocer, to whom he had hitherto paid cash, called a halt when Martin's bill reached the magnificent total of $3.85. "For you see," said the grocer, "you no catch the work, I lose the man." And Martin could reply nothing. There was no way of explaining. It was not true business principle to allow credit to a strong-bodied young fellow of the working class who was too lazy to work. "You catch the job, I let you have more of the grub," the grocer assured Martin. "No job, no grub. That the business." And then, to show that it was purely business foresight and not prejudice, "Have a drink under the house. Good friends, just the same." So Martin drank, in his easy way to show that he was good friends with the house, and then went supperless to bed. The fruit store, where Martin had bought his vegetables, was run by an American whose business principles were so weak that he let Martin run a bill of $5 before stopping his credit. The baker stopped at $2 and the butcher at $4. Martin added his debts and found that he was possessed of a total credit in all the world of $14.85. He was up with his typewriter rent, but he estimated that he could get 2 months' credit on that, which would be $8. When that occurred, he would have exhausted all possible credit. The last purchase from the fruit store had been a sack of potatoes, and for a week he had potatoes and nothing but potatoes, 3 times a day. An occasional dinner at Ruth's helped to keep strength in his body, though he found it tantalizing enough to refuse further helping when his appetite was raging at sight of so much food spread before it. Now and again, though afflicted with secret shame, he dropped in at his sister's at mealtime and ate as much as he dared, more than he dared at the Morse table. Day by day he worked on, and day by day the postman delivered to him rejected manuscripts. He had no money for stamps, so the manuscripts accumulated in a heap under the table. Came a day when for 40 hours he had not tasted food. He could not hope for a meal at Ruth's, for she was away to San Rafael on a 2 weeks' visit, and for very shame's sake he could not go to his sister's. To cap misfortune, the postman, in his afternoon round, brought him 5 returned manuscripts. Then it was that Martin wore his overcoat down into Oakland and came back without it, but with $5 tinkling in his pocket. He paid $1 each on account to the 4 tradesmen, and in his kitchen fried steak and onions, made coffee, and stewed a large pot of prunes. And having dined, he sat down at his table desk and completed before midnight an essay which he entitled The Dignity of Usury. Having typed it out, he flung it under the table, for there had been nothing left from the $5 for which to buy stamps. Later on, he pawned his watch, and still later his wheel, reducing the amount available for food by putting stamps on all his manuscripts and sending them out. He was disappointed with his hack work. Nobody cared to buy. He compared it with what he found in the newspapers, weeklies, and cheap magazines, and decided that his was better, far better than the average. Yet it would not sell. Then he discovered that most of the newspapers printed a great deal of what was called plate stuff, and he got the address of the association that furnished it. His own work that he sent in was returned, along with a stereotyped slip informing him that the staff supplied all the copy that was needed. In one of the great juvenile periodicals he noted whole columns of incident and anecdote. Here was a chance. His paragraphs were returned, and though he tried repeatedly, he never succeeded in placing one. Later on, when it no longer mattered, he learned that the associate editors and sub-editors augmented their salaries by supplying those paragraphs themselves. The comic weeklies returned his jokes and humorous verse, and the light society verse he wrote for the large magazine found no abiding place. Then there was the newspaper storiette. He knew that he could write better ones than were published. Managing to obtain the addresses of 2 newspaper syndicates, he deluged them with storiettes. When he had written 20 and failed to place one of them, he ceased. And yet, from day to day, he read storiettes in the dailies and weeklies, scores and scores of storiettes, not one of which would compare with his. In his despondency, he concluded that he had no judgment whatever, that he was hypnotized by what he wrote, and that he was a self-deluded pretender. The inhuman editorial machine ran smoothly as ever. He folded the stamps in with his manuscript, dropped it into the letterbox, and from 3 weeks to a month afterward the postman came up the steps and handed him the manuscript. Surely there were no live, warm editors at the other end. It was all wheels and cogs and oil cups, a clever mechanism operated by automatons. He reached stages of despair wherein he doubted if editors existed at all. He had never received a sign of the existence of one, and from absence of judgment in rejecting all he wrote, it seemed plausible that editors were myths, manufactured and maintained by office boys, typesetters, and pressmen. The hours he spent with Ruth were the only happy ones he had, and they were not all happy. He was afflicted always by the gnawing restlessness, more tantalizing than in the old days before he possessed her love, for now that he did possess her love, the possession of her was far away as ever. He had asked for 2 years, Time was flying, and he was achieving nothing. Again, he was always conscious of the fact that she did not approve of what he was doing. She did not say so directly, yet indirectly she let him understand it as clearly and definitely as she could have spoken it. It was not resentment with her, but disapproval, though less sweet-natured women might have resented where she was no more than disappointed. Her disappointment lay in that this man she had taken to mould refused to be moulded. To a certain extent, she had found his clay plastic. Then it had developed stubbornness, declining to be shaped in the image of her father or of Mr. Butler. What was great and strong in him she missed, or, worse yet, misunderstood. This man, whose clay was so plastic that he could live in any number of pigeonholes of human existence, she thought wilful and most obstinate because she could not shape him to live in her pigeonhole, which was the only one she knew. She could not follow the flights of his mind, and when his brain got beyond her, she deemed him erratic. Nobody else's brain ever got beyond her. She could always follow her father and mother, her brothers and only. Wherefore, when she could not follow Martin, she believed the fault lay with him. It was the old tragedy of insularity trying to serve as a mentor to the universal. "You worship at the shrine of the establishment," he told her once, in a discussion they had over Praps and Vanderwater. "I grant that as authorities to quote they are most excellent, the two foremost literary critics in the United States. Every schoolteacher in the land looks up to Vanderwater as the dean of American criticism. Yet I read his stuff, and it seems to me the perfection of the felicitous expression of the inane. Why, he is no more than a ponderous bromide, thanks to Gellert Burgess, and perhaps is no better. His Hemlock Moses, for instance, is beautifully written, not a comma is out of place, and the tone, is lofty. So lofty. He is the best-paid critic in the United States, though heaven forbid he's not a critic at all. They do criticism better in England. But the point is, they sound the popular note, and they sound it so beautifully and morally and contentedly. Their reviews remind me of a British Sunday. They are the popular mouthpieces. They back up your professors of English, and your professors of English back them up. And there isn't an original idea in any of their skulls. They know only the established. In fact, they are the established. They are weak-minded, and the established impresses itself upon them as easily as the name of the brewery is impressed on a beer bottle. And their function is to catch all the young fellows attending the university to drive out of their minds any glimmering originality that may chance to be there, and to put upon them the stamp of the established. "I think I am nearer the truth," she replied, "when I stand by the established than you are, raging around like an iconoclastic South Sea Islander." "It was the missionary who did the image-breaking," he laughed, "and unfortunately all the missionaries are off among the heathen, so there are none left at home to break those old images, Mr. Vanderwater and Mr. Praps." "And the college professors as well?" she added. He shook his head emphatically. "No, the science professors should live. They're really great. But it would be a good deed to break the heads of 9/10 of the English professors, little microscopic-minded parrots." Which was rather severe on the professors, but which to Ruth was blasphemy. She could not help but measure the professors, neat, scholarly, in fitting clothes, speaking in well-modulated voices, breathing of culture and refinement, with this almost indescribable young fellow whom somehow she loved, whose clothes never would fit him, whose heavy muscles told of damning toil, who grew excited when he talked, substituting abuse for calm statement and passionate utterance for cool self-possession. They at least earned good salaries and were, yes, she compelled herself to face it, were gentlemen, while he could not earn a penny and he was not as they. She did not weigh Martin's words nor judge his argument by them. Her conclusion that his argument was wrong was reached unconsciously, it is true, by a comparison of externals. They, the professors, were right in their literary judgments because they were successes. Martin's literary judgments were wrong because he could not sell his wares. To use his own phrase, they made good, and he did not make good. And besides, it did not seem reasonable that he should be right, he who had stood so short a time before in that same living-room, blushing and awkward, acknowledging his introduction, looking fearfully about him at the bric-a-brac his swinging shoulders threatened to break, asking how long since Swinburne died, and boastfully announcing that he had read Excelsior and the Psalm of Life. Unwittingly, Ruth herself proved his point that she worshipped the established. Martin followed the process of her thoughts, but forbore to go farther. He did not love her for what she thought of Praps and Vanderwater and English professors, and he was coming to realize, with increasing conviction, that he possessed brain areas and stretches of knowledge which she could never comprehend nor know existed. In music, she thought him unreasonable, and in the matter of opera not only unreasonable, but wilfully perverse. "How did you like it?" she asked him one night on the way home from the opera. It was a night when he had taken her at the expense of a month's rigid economizing on food. After vainly waiting for him to speak about it, herself still tremulous and stirred by what she had just seen and heard, she had asked the question. "I liked the overture," was his answer. "It was splendid." "Yes, but the opera itself?" "That was splendid too. That is, the orchestra was, though I'd have enjoyed it more if those jumping jacks had kept quiet or gone off the stage." Ruth was aghast. "You don't mean Tetralani or Barillo?" she queried. "All of them, the whole kit and crew." "But they are great artists," she protested. "They spoiled the music just the same, with their antics and unrealities." "But don't you like Barillo's voice?" Ruth asked. "He is next to Caruso, they say." "Of course I liked him, and I like Tetralani even better. Her voice is exquisite, or at least I think so." But, Ruth stammered, "I don't know what you mean, then. You admire their voices, yet you say they spoiled the music." "Precisely that. I'd give anything to hear them in concert, and I'd give even a bit more not to hear them when the orchestra is playing. I'm afraid I am a hopeless realist. Great singers are not great actors. To hear Barillo sing a love passage with the voice of an angel, and to hear Tetralani reply like another angel, and to hear it all accompanied by a perfect orgy of glowing and colourful music is ravishing, most ravishing. I do not admit it, I assert it, but the whole effect is spoiled when I look at them, at Tetralani, 5'10" in her stocking feet and weighing 190 pounds, and at Barillo, a scant 5'4", greasy-featured, with the chest of a squat, undersized blacksmith, and at the pair of them, attitudinizing, clasping their breasts, flinging their arms in the air like demented creatures in an asylum, and when I am expected to accept all this as the faithful illusion of a love scene between a slender and beautiful princess and a handsome, romantic young prince, why, I can't accept it, that's all. It's rot. It's absurd. It's unreal. That's what's the matter with it. It's not real. Don't tell me that anybody in this world ever made love that way. Why, if I'd made love to you in such fashion, you'd have boxed my ears." "But you misunderstand," Ruth protested. "Every form of art has its limitations." She was busy recalling a lecture she had heard at the university on the conventions of the arts. "In painting, there are only 2 dimensions to the canvas, yet you accept the illusion of 3 dimensions, which the art of a painter enables him to throw into the canvas. In writing, again, the author must be omnipotent. You accept as perfectly legitimate the author's account of the secret thoughts of the heroine, and yet all the time you know that the heroine was alone when thinking these thoughts, and that neither the author nor anyone else was capable of hearing them. And so with the stage, with sculpture, with opera, with every art form, certain irreconcilable things must be accepted. Yes, I understand that, Martin answered. All the arts have their conventions. Ruth was surprised at his use of the word. It was as if he had studied at the university himself, instead of being ill-equipped from browsing at haphazard through the books in the library. But even the conventions must be real. Trees, painted on flat cardboard and stuck up on each side of the stage, we accept as a forest. It is a real enough convention. But, on the other hand, we would not accept a sea scene as a forest. We can't do it. It violates our senses. Nor would you, or rather should you, accept the ravings and writhings and agonized contortions of those two lunatics tonight as a convincing portrayal of love. "But you don't hold yourself superior to all the judges of music?" she protested. No, not for a moment. I merely maintain my right as an individual. I have just been telling you what I think in order to explain why the elephantine gambols of Madame Tetralani spoil the orchestra for me. The world's judges of music may all be right, but I am I, and I won't subordinate my taste to the unanimous judgment of mankind. If I don't like a thing, I don't like it, that's all. And there is no reason under the sun why I should ape a liking for it just because the majority of my fellow creatures like it, or make believe they like it. I can't follow the fashions in the things I like or dislike. But music, you know, is a matter of training, Ruth argued, and opera is even more a matter of training. May it not be that I am not trained in opera? He dashed in. She nodded. The very thing, he agreed, and I consider I am fortunate in not having been caught when I was young. If I had, I could have wept sentimental tears tonight, and the clownish antics of that precious pair would have but enhanced the beauty of their voices and the beauty of the accompanying orchestra. You are right. It's mostly a matter of training, and I am too old now. I must have the real or nothing. An illusion that won't convince is a palpable lie, and that's what grand opera is to me. When little Barillo throws a fit, clutches mighty Tetralani in his arms, also in a fit, and tells her how passionately he adores her. Again, Ruth measured his thoughts by comparison of externals and in accordance with her belief in the established. Who was he that he should be right and all the cultured world wrong? His words and thoughts made no impression upon her. She was too firmly entrenched in the established to have any sympathy with revolutionary ideas. She had always been used to music. She had enjoyed opera ever since she was a child, and all her world had enjoyed it too. Then by what right did Martin Eden emerge, as he had so recently emerged, from his ragtime and working-class songs, and pass judgment on the world's music? She was vexed with him, and as she walked beside him she had a vague feeling of outrage. At the best, in her most charitable frame of mind, she considered the statement of his views to be a caprice, an erratic and uncalled-for prank. But when he took her in his arms at the door and kissed her good night in tender lover fashion, she forgot everything in the outrush of her own love to him. And later, on a sleepless pillow, she puzzled, as she had often puzzled of late, as to how it was that she loved so strange a man, and loved him despite the disapproval of her people. And next day Martin Eden cast hack work aside, and at white heat hammered out an essay to which he gave the title, The Philosophy of Illusion. A stamp started it on its travels, but it was destined to receive many stamps, and to be started on many travels in the months that followed. Chapter 25. Maria Silva was poor, and all the ways of poverty were clear to her. Poverty, to Ruth, was a word signifying a not nice condition of existence. That was her total knowledge on the subject. She knew Martin was poor, and his condition she associated in her mind with the boyhood of Abraham Lincoln, of Mr. Butler, and of other men who had become successes. Also, while aware that poverty was anything but delectable, she had a comfortable middle-class feeling that poverty was salutary, that it was a sharp spur that urged on to success all men who were not degraded and hopeless drudges. So that her knowledge that Martin was so poor that he had pawned his watch and overcoat did not disturb her. She even considered it the hopeful side of the situation, believing that sooner or later it would arouse him and compel him to abandon his writing. Ruth never read hunger in Martin's face, which had grown lean and had enlarged the slight hollows in the cheeks. In fact, she marked the change in his face with satisfaction. It seemed to refine him, to remove from him much of the dross of flesh and the too animal-like vigour that lured her while she detested it. Sometimes, when with her, she noted an unusual brightness in his eyes, and she admired it, for it made him appear more the poet and less the scholar, the things he would have liked to be and which she would have liked him to be. But Maria Silva read a different tale in the hollow cheeks and the burning eyes, and she noted the changes in them from day to day, by them following the ebb and flow of his fortunes. She saw him leave the house with his overcoat and return without it, though the day was chill and raw, and promptly she saw his cheeks fill out slightly and the fire of hunger leave his eyes. In the same way she had seen his wheel and watch go, and after each event she had seen his vigour bloom again. Likewise, she watched his toils, and knew the measure of the midnight oil he burned. Work! She knew that he outdid her, though his work was of a different order, and she was surprised to behold that the less food he had, the harder he worked. On occasion, in a casual sort of way, when she thought hunger pinched hardest, she would send him in a loaf of new baking, awkwardly covering the act with banter to the effect that it was better than he could bake. And again, she would send one of her toddlers in to him with a great pitcher of hot soup, debating inwardly the while whether she was justified in taking it from the mouths of her own flesh and blood. Nor was Martin ungrateful, knowing as he did the lives of the poor, and that if ever in the world there was charity, this was it. On a day when she had filled her brood with what was left in the house, Maria invested her last 15 cents in a gallon of cheap wine. Martin, coming into her kitchen to fetch water, was invited to sit down and drink. He drank her very good health, and in return she drank his. Then she drank to prosperity in his undertakings, and he drank to the hope that James Grant would show up and pay for his washing. James Grant was a journeyman carpenter who did not always pay his bills and who owed Maria $3. Both Maria and Martin drank the sour new wine on empty stomachs, and it went swiftly to their heads. Utterly differentiated creatures that they were lonely in their misery, and though the misery was tacitly ignored, it was the bond that drew them together. Maria was amazed to learn that he had been to the Azores, where she had lived until she was 11. She was doubly amazed that he had been in the Hawaiian Islands, whither she had migrated from the Azores with her people. But her amazement passed all bounds when he told her he had been on Maui, the particular island whereon she had obtained womanhood and married. Kahahuli, where she had first met her husband. He, Martin, had been there twice. Yes, she remembered the sugar steamers, and he had been on them. Well, well, it was a small world. And Wailuku, that place too. Did he know the head lunar of the plantation? Yes, and had had a couple of drinks with him. And so they reminisced and drowned their hunger in the raw, sour wine. To Martin, the future did not seem so dim. Success trembled just before him. He was on the verge of clasping it. Then he studied the deep-lined face of the toil-worn woman before him, remembered her soups and loaves of new baking, and felt spring up in him the warmest gratitude and philanthropy. "Maria," he exclaimed suddenly, "what would you like to have?" She looked at him, bepuzzled. "What would you like to have now, right now, if you could get it?" "Shoe all de round for the childs. 7 pairs de shoe." "You shall have them," he announced, while she nodded her head gravely. "But I mean a big wish, something big that you want." Her eyes sparkled good-naturedly. He was choosing to make fun with her, Maria, with whom few made fun these days. "Think hard," he cautioned, just as she was opening her mouth to speak. "All right," she answered. "I think of de hard. I like de house. This house. All mine. No pay de rent. $7 de month." "You shall have it," he grunted, "in a short time. Now wish the great wish. Make believe I am God, and I say to you anything you want you can have. Then you wish that thing, and I listened." Maria considered solemnly for a space. "You no 'fraid?" she asked warningly. No, he laughed. "I'm not afraid. Go ahead." "Must a very big," she warned again. "All right, fire away." "Well, then." She drew a big breath like a child as she voiced to the uttermost all she cared to demand of life. "I like to have a one milker ranch, good milker ranch, plenty cow, plenty land, plenty grass. I like her to have near San Leanne. My sister live there. I sell her the milk in Auckland. I make her the plenty mon. Joe and Nick run her the cow. They go to a school. Bimeby make her the good engineer, work at the railroad. Yes, I like her the milk ranch." She paused and regarded Martin with twinkling eyes. "You shall have it," he answered promptly. She nodded her head and touched her lips courteously to the wine-glass, and to the giver of the gift she knew would never be given. His heart was right, and in her own heart she appreciated his intention as much as if the gift had gone with it. "No, Maria," he went on, "Nick and Joe won't have to peddle milk, and all the kids can go to school and wear shoes the whole year round. It will be a first-class milk ranch, everything complete. There will be a house to live in, and a stable for the horses, and cow barns, of course. There will be chickens, pigs, vegetables, fruit trees, and everything like that, and there will be enough cows to pay for a hired man or two. Then you won't have anything to do but take care of the children. For that matter, if you find a good man, you can marry and take it easy while he runs the ranch." And from such largesse, dispensed from his future, Martin turned and took his one good suit of clothes to the pawnshop. His plight was desperate for him to do this, for it cut him off from Ruth. He had no second-best suit that was presentable, and though he could go to the butcher and the baker, and even on occasion to his sister's, it was beyond all daring to dream of entering the Morse home so disreputably apparelled. He toiled on, miserable and well-nigh hopeless. It began to appear to him that the second battle was lost, and that he would have to go to work. In doing this, he would satisfy everybody, the grocer, his sister, Ruth, and even Maria, to whom he owed a month's room rent. He was 2 months behind with his typewriter, and the agency was clamouring for payment or for the return of the machine. In desperation, all but ready to surrender, to make a truce with fate until he could get a fresh start, he took the civil service examinations for the railway mail. To his surprise, he passed first. The job was assured, though when the call would come to enter upon his duties, nobody knew. It was at this time, at the lowest ebb, that the smooth-running editorial machine broke down. A cog must have slipped or an oil cup run dry, for the postman brought him one morning a short, thin envelope. Martin glanced at the upper left-hand corner and read the name and address of the Transcontinental Monthly. His heart gave a great leap, and he suddenly felt faint, the sinking feeling accompanied by a strange trembling of the knees. he staggered into his room and sat down on the bed, the envelope still unopened, and in that moment came understanding to him how people suddenly fall dead upon receipt of extraordinarily good news. Of course, this was good news. There was no manuscript in that thin envelope. Therefore, it was an acceptance. He knew the story in the hands of the Transcontinental. It was The Ring of Bells, one of his horror stories, and it was an even 5,000 words. And, since first-class magazines always paid on acceptance, there was a check inside. 2 cents a word, $20 1,000. The check must be $100. $100! As he tore the envelope open, every item of all his debts surged in his brain. $3.85 to the grocer, butcher $4 flat, baker $2, fruit store $5, total $14.85. Then there was the room rent, $2.50, another month in advance, $2.50, 2 months typewriter, $8 a month in advance, $4, total $31.85. And finally to be added, his pledges plus interest with the pawnbroker. Watch, $5.50. Overcoat, $5.50. Wheel, $7.75. Suit of clothes, $5.50. 60% interest, but what did it matter? Grand total, $56.10. He saw, as if visible in the air before him, in illuminated figures, the whole sum, and the subtraction that followed, and that gave a remainder of $43.90. When he had squared every debt, redeemed every pledge, he would still have jingling in his pockets a princely $43.90. And on top of that, he would have a month's rent paid in advance on the typewriter and on the room. By this time, he had drawn the single sheet of typewritten letter out and spread it open. There was no check. He peered into the envelope, held it to the light, but could not trust his eyes, and in trembling haste tore the envelope apart. There was no check. He read the letter, skimming it line by line, dashing through the editor's praise of his story to the meat of the letter, the statement why the check had not been sent. He found no such statement, but he did find that which made him suddenly wilt. The letter slid from his hand. His eyes went lackluster, and he lay back on the pillow, pulling the blanket about him and up to his chin. $5 for The Ring of Bells. $5 for 5,000 words. Instead of 2 cents a word, 10 words for a cent. And the editor had praised it too, and he would receive the check when the story was published. Then it was all poppycock. 2 cents a word for minimum rate and payment upon acceptance. It was a lie, and it had led him astray. He would never have attempted to write had he known that. He would have gone to work for Ruth. He went back to the day he first attempted to write, and was appalled at the enormous waste of time, and all for 10 words for a cent. And the other high rewards of writers that he had read about must be lies too. His second-hand ideas of authorship were wrong, for here was the proof of it. The Transcontinental sold for 25 cents, and its dignified and artistic cover proclaimed it as among the first-class magazines. It was a staid, respectable magazine, and it had been published continuously since long before he was born. Why, on the outside cover were printed every month the words of one of the world's great writers, words proclaiming the inspired mission of the Transcontinental by a star of literature whose first coruscations had appeared inside those self-same covers. And the high and lofty heaven-inspired Transcontinental paid $5 for 5,000 words. The great writer had recently died in a foreign land, in dire poverty, Martin remembered, which was not to be wondered at, considering the magnificent pay authors receive. Well, he had taken the bait, the newspaper lies about writers and their pay, and he had wasted 2 years over it. But he would disgorge the bait now. Not another line would he ever write. He would do what Ruth wanted him to do, what everybody wanted him to do, get a job. The thought of going to work reminded him of Joe, tramping through the land of nothing to do. Martin heaved a great sigh of envy. The reaction of 19 hours a day for many days was strong upon him. But then Joe was not in love, had none of the responsibilities of love, and he could afford to loaf through the land of nothing to do. He, Martin, had something to work for, and go to work he would. He would start out early next morning to hunt a job, and he would let Ruth know, too, that he had mended his ways and was willing to go into her father's office. $5 for 5,000 words, 10 words for a cent, the market price for art. The disappointment of it, the lie of it, the infamy of it were uppermost in his thoughts, and under his closed eyelids, in fiery figures, burned the $3.85 he owed the grocer. He shivered, and was aware of an aching in his bones. The small of his back ached especially. His head ached, the top of it ached, the back of it ached, the brains inside of it ached, and seemed to be swelling, while the ache over his brows was intolerable. And beneath the brows, planted under his lids, was the merciless $3.85. He opened his eyes to escape it, but the white light of the room seemed to sear the balls and forced him to close his eyes, when the $3.85 confronted him again. $5 for 5,000 words, 10 words for a cent. That particular thought took up its residence in his brain, and he could no more escape it than he could the $3.85 under his eyelids. A change seemed to come over the latter, and he watched curiously till $2 burned in its stead. Ah, he thought, that was the baker. The next sum that appeared was $2.50. It puzzled him, and he pondered it as if life and death hung on the solution. He owed somebody $2.50. That was certain. But who was it? To find it was the task set him by an imperious and malignant universe, and he wandered through the endless corridors of his mind, opening all manner of lumber rooms and chambers stored with odds and ends of memories and knowledge as he vainly sought the answer. After several centuries it came to him, easily, without effort, that it was Maria. With a great relief he turned his soul to the screen of torment under his lids. He had solved the problem. Now he could rest. But no, the $2.50 faded away, and in its place burned $8. Who was that? He must go the dreary round of his mind again and find out. How long he was gone on this quest he did not know, but after what seemed an enormous lapse of time, he was called back to himself by a knock at the door, and by Maria's asking if he was sick. He replied in a muffled voice he did not recognize, saying that he was merely taking a nap. He was surprised when he noted the darkness of night in the room. He had received the letter at 2 in the afternoon, and he realized that he was sick. Then the $8 began to smoulder under his lids again, and he returned himself to servitude. But he grew cunning. There was no need for him to wander through his mind. He had been a fool. He pulled a lever and made his mind revolve about him, a monstrous wheel of fortune, a merry-go-round of memory, a revolving sphere of wisdom. Faster and faster it revolved, until its vortex sucked him in, and he was flung whirling through black chaos. Quite naturally he found himself at a mangle, feeding starched cuffs. But as he fed, he noticed figures printed in the cuffs. It was a new way of marking linen, he thought, until, looking closer, he saw $3.85 on one of the cuffs. Then it came to him that it was the grocer's bill, and that these were his bills flying around on the drum of the mangle. A crafty idea came to him. He would throw the bills on the floor and so escape paying them. No sooner thought than done, and he crumpled the cuffs spitefully as he flung them upon an unusually dirty floor. Ever the heap grew, and though each bill was duplicated 1,000 times, he found only one for $2.50, which was what he owed Maria. That meant that Maria would not press for payment, and he resolved generously that it would be the only one he would pay. So he began searching through the cast-out heaps for hers. He sought it desperately, for ages, and was still searching when the manager of the hotel entered, the fat Dutchman. His face blazed with wrath, and he shouted in stentorian tones that echoed down the universe, "I shall deduct the cost of those cuffs from your wages." The pile of cuffs grew like a mountain, and Martin knew that he was doomed to toil for 1,000 years to pay for them. Well, there was nothing left to do but kill the manager and burn down the laundry. But the big Dutchman frustrated him, seizing him by the nape of the neck and dancing him up and down. He danced him over the ironing tables, the stove, and the mangles, and out into the washroom and over the wringer and washer. Martin was danced until his teeth rattled and his head ached, and he marvelled that the Dutchman was so strong. And then he found himself before the mangle. This time, receiving the cuffs, an editor of a magazine was feeding from the other side. Each cuff was a cheque, and Martin went over them anxiously, in a fever of expectation, but they were all blanks. He stood there and received the blanks for 1,000,000 years or so, never letting one go by for fear it might be filled out. At last he found it. With trembling fingers he held it to the light. It was for $5. "Ha, ha!" laughed the editor across the mangle. "Well then, I shall kill you," Martin said. He went out into the washroom to get the axe, and found Joe starching manuscripts. He tried to make him desist, then swung the axe for him. But the weapon remained poised in mid-air, for Martin found himself back in the ironing room in the midst of a snowstorm. No, it was not snow that was falling, but cheques of large denomination, the smallest not less than $1,000. He began to collect them and sort them out, in packages of 100, tying each package securely with twine. He looked up from his task and saw Joe standing before him juggling flat irons, starched shirts, and manuscripts. Now and again he reached out and added a bundle of cheques to the flying miscellany that soared through the roof and out of sight in a tremendous circle. Martin struck at him, but he seized the axe and added it to the flying circle. Then he plucked Martin and added him. Martin went up through the roof, clutching at manuscripts, so that by the time he came down he had a large armful. But no sooner down than up again, and a second and a third time and countless times he flew around the circle. From far off he could hear a childish treble singing, "Waltz me around again, Willie, around, around, around." He recovered the axe in the midst of the Milky Way of cheques, starched shirts and manuscripts, and prepared when he came down to kill Joe. But he did not come down. Instead, at 2 a.m, Maria, having heard his groans through the thin partition, came into his room to put hot flat irons against his body and damp cloths upon his aching eyes. Chapter 26. Martin Eden did not go out to hunt for a job in the morning. It was late afternoon before he came out of his delirium and gazed with aching eyes about the room. Mary, one of the tribe of Silvia, 8 years old, keeping watch, raised a screech at sight of his returning consciousness. Maria hurried into the room from the kitchen. She put her work-calloused hand upon his hot forehead and felt his pulse. "You like a diet?" she asked. He shook his head. Eating was farthest from his desire, and he wondered that he should ever have been hungry in his life. "I'm sick, Maria," he said weakly. "What is it? Do you know?" "Grip," she answered. 2 or 3 days you alla de right. Better you no eat now. Bimeby plenty can eat. Tomorrow can eat maybe." Martin was not used to sickness, and when Maria and her little girl left him, he essayed to get up and dress. By supreme exertion of will, with rearing brain and eyes that ached so that he could not keep them open, he managed to get out of bed, only to be left stranded by his senses upon the table. Half an hour later he managed to regain the bed, where he was content to lie with closed eyes and analyse his various pains and weaknesses. Maria came in several times to change the cold cloths on his forehead. Otherwise she left him in peace, too wise to vex him with chatter. This moved him to gratitude, and he murmured to himself, "Maria, you get a dat a milk a ranch. All right." Then he remembered his long-buried past of yesterday. It seemed a lifetime since he had received that letter from the Transcontinental. A lifetime since it was all over and done with, and a new page turned. He had shot his bolt, and shot it hard, and now he was down on his back. If he hadn't starved himself, he wouldn't have been so caught by la grippe. He had been run down, and he had not had the strength to throw off the germ of disease which had invaded his system. This was what resulted. "What does it profit a man to write a whole library and lose his own life?" he demanded aloud. "This is no place for me. No more literature in mine. Me for the counting-house and ledger, the monthly salary, and the little home with Ruth." 2 days later, having eaten an egg and 2 slices of toast and drunk a cup of tea, he asked for his mail, but found his eyes still hurt too much to permit him to read. "You read it for me, Maria," he said. "Never mind the big, long sentences. Throw them under the table. Read me the small letters." "No can," was the answer. "Teresa, she go to school. She can." So Teresa Silvia, aged 9, opened his letters and read them to him. He listened absently to a long dun from the typewriter people, his mind busy with ways and means of finding a job. Suddenly he was shocked back into himself. "We offer you $40 for all serial rights in your story," Teresa slowly spelled out, "provided you allow us to make the alterations suggested." "What magazine is that?" Martin shouted. "Here, give it to me." He could see to read now, and he was unaware of the pain of the action. It was the White Mouse that was offering him $40, and the story was The Whirlpool, another of his early horror stories. He read the letter through again and again. The editor told him plainly that he had not handled the idea properly, but that it was the idea they were buying because it was original. If they could cut the story down 1/3, they would take it and send him $40 on receipt of his answer. He called for pen and ink, and told the editor he could cut the story down 3/3 if he wanted to, and to send the $40 right along. The letter dispatched to the letterbox by Teresa, Martin lay back and thought, it wasn't a lie after all. The White Mouse paid on acceptance. There were 3,000 words in The Whirlpool. Cut down 1/3, there would be 2,000. At $40, that would be 2 cents a word. Pay on acceptance and 2 cents a word. The newspapers had told the truth, and he had thought the White Mouse a third-rater. It was evident that he did not know the magazines. He had deemed the Transcontinental a first-rater, and it paid a cent for 10 words. He had classed the White Mouse of no account, and it paid 20 times as much as the Transcontinental, and also had paid on acceptance. Well, there was one thing certain. When he got well, he would not go out looking for a job. There were more stories in his head as good as The Whirlpool, and at $40 apiece he could earn far more than in any job or position. Just when he thought the battle lost, it was won. He had proved for his career. The way was clear. Beginning with The White Mouse, he would add magazine after magazine to his growing list of patrons. Hack work could be put aside. For that matter, it had been wasted time, for it had not brought him $1. He would devote himself to work, good work, and he would pour out the best that was in him. He wished Ruth was there to share in his joy, and when he went over the letters left lying on his bed, he found one from her. It was sweetly reproachful, wondering what had kept him away for so dreadful a length of time. He reread the letter adoringly, dwelling over her handwriting, loving each stroke of her pen, and in the end kissing her signature. And when he answered, he told her recklessly that he had not been to see her because his best clothes were in pawn. He told her that he had been sick, but was once more nearly well, and that inside 10 days or 2 weeks, as soon as a letter could travel to New York City and return, he would redeem his clothes and be with her. But Ruth did not care to wait 10 days or 2 weeks. Besides, her lover was sick. The next afternoon, accompanied by Arthur, she arrived in the Morse carriage, to the unqualified delight of the Silver tribe and of all the urchins on the street, and to the consternation of Maria. She boxed the ears of the Silvers who crowded about the visitors on the tiny front porch, and in more than unusual atrocious English tried to apologize for her appearance. Sleeves rolled up from soap-flecked arms and a wet gunny sack around her waist told of the task at which she had been caught. So flustered was she by 2 such grand young people asking for her lodger that she forgot to invite them to sit down in the little parlour. To enter Martin's room, they passed through the kitchen, warm and moist and steamy from the big washing in progress. Maria, in her excitement, jammed the bedroom and bedroom closet doors together, and for 5 minutes, through the partly open door, clouds of steam, smelling of soapsuds and dirt, poured into the sick chamber. Ruth succeeded in veering right and left and right again, and in running the narrow passage between table and bed to Martin's side. But Arthur veered too wide and fetched up with clatter and bang of pots and pans in the corner where Martin did his cooking. Arthur did not linger long. Ruth occupied the only chair, and having done his duty, he went outside and stood by the gate, the centre of 7 marvelling Silvers who watched him as they would have watched a curiosity in a sideshow. All about the carriage were gathered the children from a dozen blocks, waiting and eager for some tragic and terrible denouement. Carriages were seen on their street only for weddings and funerals. Here was neither marriage nor death. Therefore, it was something transcending experience and well worth waiting for. Martin had been wild to see Ruth. He was essentially a love nature, and he possessed more than the average man's need for sympathy. He was starving for sympathy, which, with him, meant intelligent understanding, and he had yet to learn that Ruth's sympathy was largely sentimental and tactful, and that it proceeded from gentleness of nature rather than from understanding of the objects of her sympathy. So it was, while Martin held her hand and gladly talked, that her love for him prompted her to press his hand in return, and that her eyes were moist and luminous at sight of his helplessness, and of the marks suffering had stamped upon his face. But while he told her of his 2 acceptances, of his despair when he received the one from the Transcontinental, and of the corresponding delight with which he received the one from the White Mouse, she did not follow him. She heard the words he uttered and understood their literal import, but she was not with him in his despair and his delight. She could not get out of herself. She was not interested in selling stories to magazines. What was important to her was matrimony. She was not aware of it, however, any more than she was aware that her desire that Martin take a position was the instinctive and preparative impulse of motherhood. She would have blushed had she been told as much in plain, set terms, and next she might have grown indignant and asserted that her sole interest lay in the man she loved and her desire for him to make the best of himself. So, while Martin poured out his heart to her, elated with the first success his chosen work in the world had received, she paid heed to his bare words only, gazing now and again about the room, shocked by what she saw. For the first time Ruth gazed upon the sordid face of poverty. Starving lovers had always seemed romantic to her, but she had had no idea how starving lovers lived. She had never dreamed it could be like this. Ever her gaze shifted from the room to him and back again. The steamy smell of dirty clothes, which had entered with her from the kitchen, was sickening. Martin must be soaked with it, Ruth concluded, if that awful woman washed frequently. Such was the contagiousness of degradation. When she looked at Martin, she seemed to see the smirch left upon him by his surroundings. She had never seen him unshaven, and the 3 days' growth of beard on his face was repulsive to her. Not alone did it give him the same dark and murky aspect of the Silver House, inside and out, but it seemed to emphasize that animal-like strength of his which she detested. And here he was, being confirmed in his madness by the 2 acceptances he took such pride in telling her about. A little longer, and he would have surrendered and gone to work. Now he would continue on in this horrible house, writing and starving for a few more months. "What is that smell?" she asked suddenly. "Some of Maria's washing smells, I imagine," was the answer. "I am growing quite accustomed to them." No, not that. It is something else, a stale, sickish smell." Martin sampled the air before replying. "I can't smell anything else except stale tobacco smoke," he announced. "That's it. It is terrible. Why do you smoke so much, Martin?" "I don't know, except that I smoke more than usual when I am lonely. And then, too, it's such a long-standing habit. I learned when I was only a youngster." "It is not a nice habit, you know," she reproved. "It smells to heaven." "That's the fault of the tobacco. I can afford only the cheapest. But wait until I get that $40 check. I'll use a brand that is not offensive even to the angels. But that wasn't so bad, was it? 2 acceptances in 3 days. That $45 will pay about all my debts." "For 2 weeks' work?" she queried. "No, for less than a week's work. Please pass me that book over on the far corner of the table, the account book with the grey cover." He opened it and began turning over the pages rapidly. "Yes, I was right. 4 days for The Ring of Bells, 2 days for The Whirlpool. That's $45 for a week's work, $180 a month. That beats any salary I can command. And, besides, I'm just beginning. $1,000 a month is not too much to buy for you all I want you to have. A salary of $500 a month would be too small. That $45 is just a starter. Wait till I get my stride, then watch my smoke." Ruth misunderstood his slang and reverted to cigarettes. "You smoke more than is enough as it is, and the brand of tobacco will make no difference. It is the smoking itself that is not nice, no matter what the brand may be. You are a chimney, a living volcano, a perambulating smokestack, and you are a perfect disgrace, Martin, my dear. You know you are." She leaned toward him, entreaty in her eyes, and as he looked at her delicate face and into her pure, limpid eyes, as of old, he was struck with his own unworthiness. "I wish you wouldn't smoke any more," she whispered. "Please, for my sake." "All right, I won't," he cried. "I'll do anything you ask, dear love. Anything. You know that." A great temptation assailed her. In an insistent way she had caught glimpses of the large, easy-going side of his nature, and she felt sure, if she asked him to cease attempting to write, that he would grant her her wish. In the swift instant that elapsed, the words trembled on her lips, but she did not utter them. She was not quite brave enough. She did not quite dare. Instead, she leaned toward him to meet him, and in his arms murmured, "You know, it is really not for my sake, Martin, but for your own. I am sure smoking hurts you, and besides, it is not good to be a slave to anything, to a drug least of all." "I shall always be your slave," he smiled. "In which case I shall begin issuing my commands." She looked at him mischievously, though deep down she was already regretting that she had not preferred her largest request. "I live but to obey your majesty." "Well, then, my first commandment is, thou shalt not omit to shave every day. Look how you have scratched my cheek." and so it ended in caresses and love-laughter. But she had made one point, and she could not expect to make more than one at a time. She felt a woman's pride in that she had made him stop smoking. Another time she would persuade him to take a position, for had he not said he would do anything she asked? She left his side to explore the room, examining the clothesline of notes overhead, learning the mystery of the tackle used for suspending his wheel under the ceiling, and being saddened by the heap of manuscripts under the table which represented to her just so much wasted time. The oil stove won her admiration, but on investigating the food shelves she found them empty. "Why, you haven't anything to eat, you poor dear," she said with tender compassion. "You must be starving." "I store my food in Maria's safe and in her pantry," he lied. "It keeps better there. No danger of my starving. Look at that." She had come back to his side, and she saw him double his arm at the elbow, the biceps crawling under his shirt sleeve and swelling into a knot of muscle, heavy and hard. The sight repelled her. Sentimentally she disliked it, but her pulse, her blood, every fibre of her loved it and yearned for it, and in the old inexplicable way she leaned toward him, not away from him. And in the moment that followed, when he crushed her in his arms, the brain of her, concerned with the superficial aspects of life, was in revolt, while the heart of her, the woman of her, concerned with life itself, exulted triumphantly. It was in moments like this that she felt to the uttermost the greatness of her love for Martin, for it was almost a swoon of delight to her to feel his strong arms about her, holding her tightly, hurting her with the grip of their fervour. At such moments she found justification for her treason to her standards, for her violation of her own high ideals, and, most of all, for her tacit disobedience to her mother and father. They did not want her to marry this man. It shocked them that she should love him. It shocked her, too, sometimes, when she was apart from him, a cool and reasoning creature. With him, she loved him. In truth, at times a vexed and worried love, but love it was, a love that was stronger than she. "This Le Grip is nothing," he was saying. "It hurts a bit and gives one a nasty headache, but it doesn't compare with the break-bone fever." "Have you had that, too?" she queried, absently, intent on the heaven-sent justification she was finding in his arms. And so, with absent queries, she led him on, till suddenly his words startled her. He had had the fever in a secret colony of 30 lepers on one of the Hawaiian Islands. "But why did you go there?" she demanded. Such royal carelessness of body seemed criminal. "Because I didn't know," he answered. "I never dreamed of lepers. When I deserted the schooner and landed on the beach, I headed inland for some place of hiding. For 3 days I lived off guavas, Ohio apples, and bananas, all of which grew wild in the jungle. On the 4th day I found the trail, a mere foot trail. It led inland, and it led up. It was the way I wanted to go, and it showed signs of recent travel. At one place it ran along the crest of a ridge that was no more than a knife edge. The trail wasn't 3 feet wide on the crest, and on either side the ridge fell away in precipices hundreds of feet deep. One man, with plenty of ammunition, could have held it against 100,000. It was the only way into the hiding place. 3 hours after I found the trail, I was there, in a little mountain valley, a pocket in the midst of lava peaks. The whole place was terraced for taro patches. Fruit trees grew there, and there were 8 or 10 grass huts. But as soon as I saw the inhabitants, I knew what I'd struck. One side of them was enough. "What did you do?" Ruth demanded, listening, like any Desdemona, appalled and fascinated. "Nothing for me to do. Their leader was a kind old fellow, pretty far gone, but he ruled like a king. He had discovered the little valley and founded the settlement, all of which was against the law. But he had guns, plenty of ammunition, and those Kanakas trained to the shooting of wild cattle and pig were dead shots. No, there wasn't any running away for Martin Eden. He stayed for 3 months. But how did you escape? I'd have been there yet if it hadn't been for a girl there, a half Chinese, quarter white, and quarter Hawaiian. She was a beauty, poor thing, and well educated. Her mother, in Honolulu, was worth $1 million or so. Well, this girl got me away at last. Her mother financed the settlement, you see, so the girl wasn't afraid of being punished for letting me go. But she made me swear, first, never to reveal the hiding place, and I never have. This is the first time I have ever mentioned it. The girl had just the first signs of leprosy. The fingers of her right hand were slightly twisted, and there was a small spot on her arm. That was all. I guess she's dead now. But weren't you frightened? And weren't you glad to get away without catching that dreadful disease? Well, he confessed, I was a bit shivery at first, but I got used to it. I used to feel sorry for that poor girl, though. That made me forget to be afraid. She was such a beauty, in spirit as well as in appearance, and she was only slightly touched. Yet she was doomed to lie there, living the life of a primitive savage and rotting slowly away. Leprosy is far more terrible than you can imagine it. Poor thing, Ruth murmured softly. It's a wonder she let you get away. How do you mean? Martin asked unwittingly. Because she must have loved you, Ruth said, still softly. Candidly now, didn't she? Martin's sunburn had been bleached by his work in the laundry and by the indoor life he was living, while the hunger and the sickness had made his face even pale, and across his pallor flowed the slow wave of a blush. He was opening his mouth to speak, but Ruth shut him off. Never mind. Don't answer. It's not necessary, she laughed. But it seemed to him there was something metallic in her laughter, and that the light in her eyes was cold. On the spur of the moment, it reminded him of a gale he had once experienced in the North Pole. And for the moment the apparition of the gale rose before his eyes. A gale at night, with a clear sky and under a full moon, the huge seas glinting coldly in the moonlight. Next, he saw the girl in the leper refuge and remembered it was for love of him that she had let him go. She was noble, he said simply. She gave me life. That was all of the incident, but he heard Ruth muffle a dry sob in her throat and noticed that she turned her face away to gaze out of the window. When she turned it back to him, it was composed, and there was no hint of the gale in her eyes. I'm such a silly, she said plaintively, but I can't help it. I do so love you, Martin. I do. I shall grow more Catholic in time, but at present I can't help being jealous of those ghosts of the past, and you know your past is full of ghosts. It must be, she silenced his protest. It could not be otherwise. And there's poor Arthur motioning me to come. He's tired waiting. And now, goodbye, dear. There's some kind of a mixture put up by the druggists that helps men stop the use of tobacco, she called back from the door, and I am going to send you some. The door closed, but opened again. I do, she whispered to him, and this time she was really gone. Maria, with worshipful eyes that nonetheless were keen to note the texture of Ruth's garments and the cut of them, a cut unknown that produced an effect mysteriously beautiful, saw her to the carriage. The crowd of disappointed urchins stared till the carriage disappeared from view, then transferred their stare to Maria, who had abruptly become the most important person on the street. But it was one of her progeny who blasted Maria's reputation by announcing that the grand visitors had been for her lodger. After that, Maria dropped back into her old obscurity, and Martin began to notice the respectful manner in which he was regarded by the small fry of the neighbourhood. As for Maria, Martin rose in her estimation a full 100%, and had the Portuguese grocer witnessed that afternoon carriage call, he would have allowed Martin an additional $3.85 worth of credit. Chapter 27. The sun of Martin's good fortune rose. The day after Ruth's visit, he received a check for $3 from a New York Scandal Weekly in payment for 3 of his triolets. 2 days later, a newspaper published in Chicago accepted his Treasure Hunters, promising to pay $10 for it on publication. The price was small, but it was the first article he had written, his very first attempt to express his thoughts on the printed page. To cap everything, the adventure serial for boys, his second attempt, was accepted before the end of the week by a juvenile monthly calling itself Youth and Age. It was true the serial was 21,000 words, and they offered to pay him $16 on publication, which was something like 75 cents a 1,000 words. But it was equally true that it was the second thing he had attempted to write, and that he was himself thoroughly aware of its clumsy worthlessness. But even his earliest efforts were not marked with the clumsiness of mediocrity. What characterized them was the clumsiness of too great strength, the clumsiness which the tyro betrays when he crushes butterflies with battering rams and hammers out vignettes with a war club. So it was that Martin was glad to sell his early efforts for songs. He knew them for what they were, and it had not taken him long to acquire this knowledge. What he pinned his faith to was his later work. He had striven to be something more than a mere writer of magazine fiction. He had sought to equip himself with the tools of artistry. On the other hand, he had not sacrificed strength. His conscious aim had been to increase his strength by avoiding excess of strength. Nor had he departed from his love of reality. His work was realism, though he had endeavoured to fuse it with the fancies and beauties of imagination. What he sought was an impassioned realism shot through with human aspiration and faith. What he wanted was life as it was, with all its spirit-groping and soul-reaching left in. He had discovered, in the course of his reading, 2 schools of fiction. One treated of man as a god, ignoring his early origin. The other treated of man as a clod, ignoring his heaven-sent dreams and divine possibilities. Both the god and the clod schools erred, in Martin's estimation, and erred through too great singleness of sight and purpose. There was a compromise that approximated the truth, though it flattered not the school of God, while it challenged the brute savageness of the school of clod. It was his story, Adventure, which had dragged with Ruth, that Martin believed had achieved his ideal of the true in fiction, and it was an essay, God and Clod, that he had expressed his views on the whole general subject. But Adventure, and all that he deemed his best work, still went begging among the editors. His early work counted for nothing in his eyes, except for the money it brought, and his horror stories, 2 of which he had sold, he did not consider high work nor his best work. To him they were frankly imaginative and fantastic, though invested with all the glamour of the real, wherein lay their power. This investiture of the grotesque and impossible with reality he looked upon as a trick, a skilful trick at best. Great literature could not reside in such a field. Their artistry was high, but he denied the worthwhileness of artistry when divorced from humanness. The trick had been to fling over the face of his artistry a mask of humanness, and this he had done in the 6 or so stories of the horror brand he had written before he emerged upon the high peaks of Adventure, Joy, The Pot, and The Wine of Life. The $3 he received for the triolets he used to eke out a precarious existence against the arrival of the white mouse check. He cashed the first check with the suspicious Portuguese grocer, paying $1 on account and dividing the remaining $2 between the baker and the fruit store. Martin was not yet rich enough to afford meat, and he was on slim allowance when the white mouse check arrived. He was divided on the cashing of it. He had never been in a bank in his life, much less been in one on business, and he had a naive and childlike desire to walk into one of the big banks down in Oakland and fling down his endorsed check for $40. On the other hand, practical common sense ruled that he should cash it with his grocer and thereby make an impression that would later result in an increase of credit. Reluctantly, Martin yielded to the claims of the grocer, paying his bill with him in full and receiving in change a pocketful of jingling coin. Also, he paid the other tradesmen in full, redeemed his suit and his bicycle, paid 1 month's rent on the typewriter, and paid Maria the overdue month for his room and a month in advance. This left him in his pocket for emergencies a balance of nearly $3. In itself, this small sum seemed a fortune. Immediately on recovering his clothes, he had gone to see Ruth, and on the way he could not refrain from jingling the little handful of silver in his pocket. He had been so long without money that, like a rescued starving man who cannot let the unconsumed food out of his sight, Martin could not keep his hand off the silver. He was not mean nor avaricious, but the money meant more than so many dollars and cents. It stood for success, and the eagles stamped upon the coins were to him so many winged victories. It came to him insensibly that it was a very good world. It certainly appeared more beautiful to him. For weeks it had been a very dull and sombre world, but now, with nearly all debts paid, $3 jingling in his pocket, and in his mind the consciousness of success, the sun shone bright and warm, and even a rain squall that soaked unprepared pedestrians seemed a merry happening to him. When he starved, his thoughts had dwelt upon the thousands he knew were starving the world over. But now that he was feasted full, the fact of the thousands starving was no longer pregnant in his brain. He forgot about them, and, being in love, remembered the countless lovers in the world. Without deliberately thinking about it, motifs for love lyrics began to agitate his brain. Swept away by the creative impulse, he got off the electric car without vexation, 2 blocks beyond his crossing. He found a number of persons in the Morse home. Ruth's 2 girl cousins were visiting her from San Rafael, and Mrs Morse, under pretext of entertaining them, was pursuing her plan of surrounding Ruth with young people. The campaign had begun during Martin's enforced absence, and was already in full swing. She was making a point of having at the house men who were doing things. Thus, in addition to the cousins, Dorothy and Florence, Martin encountered 2 university professors, one of Latin, the other of English. A young army officer just back from the Philippines, one-time schoolmate of Ruth's, a young fellow named Melville, private secretary to Joseph Perkins, head of the San Francisco Trust Company, and finally of the men, a live bank cashier, Charles Hapgood, a youngish man of 35, graduate of Stanford University, member of the Nile Club and the Unity Club, and a conservative speaker for the Republican Party during campaigns. In short, a rising young man in every way. Among the women was one who painted portraits, another who was a professional musician, and still another who possessed the degree of Doctor of Sociology and who was locally famous for her social settlement work in the slums of San Francisco. But the women did not count for much in Mrs Morse's plan. At the best, they were necessary accessories. The men who did things must be drawn to the house somehow. "Don't get excited when you talk," Ruth admonished Martin before the ordeal of introduction began. He bore himself a bit stiffly at first, oppressed by a sense of his own awkwardness, especially of his shoulders, which were up to their old trick of threatening destruction to furniture and ornaments. Also, he was rendered self-conscious by the company. He had never before been in contact with such exalted beings, nor with so many of them. Melville, the bank cashier, fascinated him, and he resolved to investigate him at the first opportunity. For underneath Martin's awe lurked his assertive ego, and he felt the urge to measure himself with these men and women, and to find out what they had learned from the books and life which he had not learned. Ruth's eyes roved to him frequently to see how he was getting on, and she was surprised and gladdened by the ease with which he got acquainted with her cousins. He certainly did not grow excited, while being seated removed from him the worry of his shoulders. Ruth knew them for clever girls, superficially brilliant, and she could scarcely understand their praise of Martin later that night at going to bed. But he, on the other hand, a wit in his own class, a gay quizzer and laughter-maker at dances on Sunday picnics, had found the making of fun and the breaking of good-natured lances simple enough in this environment. And on this evening, success stood at his back, patting him on the shoulder and telling him that he was making good, so that he could afford to laugh and make laughter and remain unabashed. Later, Ruth's anxiety found justification. Martin and Professor Caldwell had got together in a conspicuous corner, and though Martin no longer wove the air with his hands, to Ruth's critical eye he permitted his own eyes to flash and glitter too frequently, talked too rapidly and warmly, grew too intense, and allowed his aroused blood to redden his cheeks too much. He lacked decorum and control, and was in decided contrast to the young professor of English with whom he talked. But Martin was not concerned with appearances. He had been swift to note the other's trained mind and to appreciate his command of knowledge. Furthermore, Professor Caldwell did not realize Martin's concept of the average English professor. Martin wanted him to talk shop, and, though he seemed averse at first, succeeded in making him do it. For Martin did not see why a man should not talk shop. "It's absurd and unfair," he had told Ruth weeks before, "this objection to talking shop. For what reason under the sun do men and women come together if not for the exchange of the best that is in them? And the best that is in them is what they are interested in, the thing by which they make their living, the thing they've specialized on and sat up days and nights over and even dreamed about. Imagine Mr. Butler living up to social etiquette and enunciating his views on Paul Verlaine or the German drama of the novels of D'Annunzio. We'd be bored to death. I, for one, if I must listen to Mr. Butler, prefer to hear him talk about his law. It's the best that is in him, and life is so short that I want the best of every man and woman I meet." "But," Ruth had objected, "there are the topics of general interest to all." "There you mistake," he had rushed on. "All persons in society, all cliques in society, or rather nearly all persons and cliques, ape their betters. Now, who are the best betters? The idlers, the wealthy idlers? They do not know, as a rule, the things known by the persons who are doing something in the world. To listen to conversation about such things would mean to be bored, wherefore the idlers decree that such things are shop and must not be talked about. Likewise, they decree the things that are not shop and which may be talked about. And those things are the latest operas, latest novels, cards, billiards, cocktails, automobiles, horse shows, trout fishing, tuna fishing, big game shooting, yacht sailing, and so forth. And mark you, these are the things the idlers know. In all truth, they constitute the shop talk of the idlers. And the funniest part of it is that many of the clever people, and all the would-be clever people, allow the idlers so to impose upon them. As for me, I want the best a man's got in him. Call it shop, vulgarity, or anything you please." And Ruth had not understood. This attack of his on the established had seemed to her just so much wilfulness of opinion. So Martin contaminated Professor Caldwell with his own earnestness, challenging him to speak his mind. As Ruth paused beside them, she heard Martin saying, "You surely don't pronounce such heresies in the University of California." Professor Caldwell shrugged his shoulders. "The honest taxpayer and the politician, you know. Sacramento gives us our appropriations, and therefore we kowtow to Sacramento, and to the board of regents, and to the party press, or to the press of both parties. Yes, that's clear, but how about you? Martin urged. You must be a fish out of the water. Few like me, I imagine, in the university pond. Sometimes I am fairly sure I am out of water, and that I should belong in Paris, in Grub Street, in a hermit's cave, or in some sadly wild bohemian crowd, drinking claret. Dago Red, they call it in San Francisco, dining in cheap restaurants in the Latin Quarter, and expressing vociferously radical views upon all creation. Really, I am frequently almost sure that I was cut out to be a radical. But then, there are so many questions on which I am not sure. I grow timid when I am face to face with my human frailty, whichever prevents me from grasping all the factors in any problem, human, vital problems, you know. And as he talked on, Martin became aware that to his own lips had come the song of the trade wind. I am the strongest at noon, but under the moon I stiffened the burnt of the sail. He was almost humming the words, and it dawned upon him that the other reminded him of the trade wind, of the northeast trade, steady and cool and strong. He was equable, he was to be relied upon, and withal there was a certain bafflement about him. Martin had the feeling that he never spoke his full mind, just as he had often had the feeling that the trades never blew their strongest, but always held reserves of strength that were never used. Martin's trick of visioning was active as ever. His brain was a most accessible storehouse of remembered fact and fancy, and its contents seemed ever ordered and spread for his inspection. Whatever occurred in the instant present, Martin's mind immediately presented associated antitheses or similitude, which ordinarily expressed themselves to him in vision. It was sheerly automatic, and his visioning was an unfailing accompaniment to the living present. Just as Ruth's face, in a momentary jealousy, had called before his eyes a forgotten moonlight gale, and as Professor Caldwell made him see again the northeast trade herding the white billows across the purple sea, so, from moment to moment, not disconcerting, but rather identifying and classifying, new memory visions rose before him, or spread under his eyelids, or were thrown up upon the screen of his consciousness. These visions came out of the actions and sensations of the past, out of things and events and books of yesterday and last week, a countless host of apparitions that, waking or sleeping, forever thronged his mind. So it was, as he listened to Professor Caldwell's easy flow of speech, the conversation of a clever, cultured man, that Martin kept seeing himself down all his past. He saw himself when he had been quite the hoodlum, wearing a stiff-rimmed Stetson hat and a square-cut, double-breasted coat, with a certain swagger to the shoulders and possessing the ideal of being as tough as the police permitted. He did not disguise it to himself, nor attempt to palliate it. At one time in his life he had been just a common hoodlum, the leader of a gang that worried the police and terrorized honest working-class householders. But his ideals had changed. He glanced about him at the well-bred, well-dressed men and women, and breathed into his lungs the atmosphere of culture and refinement, and at the same moment the ghost of his early youth, in stiff rim and square cut, with swagger and toughness, stalked across the room. This figure of the corner hoodlum he saw merge into himself, sitting and talking with an actual university professor. For, after all, he had never found his permanent abiding place. He had fitted in wherever he found himself, been a favourite always and everywhere by virtue of holding his own at work and at play, and by his willingness and ability to fight for his rights and command respect. But he had never taken root. He had fitted in sufficiently to satisfy his fellows, but not to satisfy himself. He had been perturbed always by a feeling of unrest, had heard always the call of something from beyond, and had wandered on through life seeking it until he found books and art and love. And here he was, in the midst of all this, the only one of all the comrades he had adventured with who could have made themselves eligible for the inside of the Morse home. But such thoughts and visions did not prevent him from following Professor Caldwell closely, and as he followed, comprehendingly and critically, he noted the unbroken field of the other's knowledge. As for himself, from moment to moment the conversation showed him gaps and open stretches, whole subjects with which he was unfamiliar. Nevertheless, thanks to his Spencer, he saw that he possessed the outlines of the field of knowledge. It was a matter only of time when he would fill in the outline. Then watch out, he thought. Wear shawl, everybody. He felt like sitting at the feet of the professor, worshipful and absorbent. But as he listened, he began to discern a weakness in the other's judgments. A weakness so stray and elusive that he might not have caught it had it not been ever present. And when he did catch it, he leapt to equality at once. Ruth came up to them a second time, just as Martin began to speak. "I'll tell you where you are wrong, or rather what weakens your judgments," he said. "You lack biology. It has no place in your scheme of things. Oh, I mean the real interpretative biology, from the ground up, from the laboratory and the test tube and the vitalized inorganic right on up to the widest aesthetic and sociological generalizations." Ruth was appalled. She had sat 2 lecture courses under Professor Caldwell and looked up to him as the living repository of all knowledge. "I scarcely follow you," he said dubiously. Martin was not so sure but what he had followed him. "Then I'll try to explain," he said. "I remember reading in Egyptian history something to the effect that understanding could not be had of Egyptian art without first studying the land question." "Quite right," the professor nodded. "And it seems to me," Martin continued, "that knowledge of the land question, in turn, of all questions, for that matter, cannot be had without previous knowledge of the stuff and the constitution of life. How can we understand laws and institutions, religions and customs, without understanding not merely the nature of the creatures that made them, but the nature of the stuff out of which the creatures are made? Is literature less human than the architecture of sculpture of Egypt? Is there one thing in the known universe that is not subject to the law of evolution? Oh, I know there is an elaborate evolution of the various arts laid down, but it seems to me to be too mechanical. The human himself is left out. The evolution of the tool, of the harp, of music and song and dance are all beautifully elaborated. But how about the evolution of the human himself? The development of the basic and intrinsic parts that were in him before he made his first tool, or gibbered his first chant? It is that which you do not consider, and which I call biology. It is biology in its largest aspects. I know I express myself incoherently, but I've tried to hammer out the idea. It came to me as you were talking, so I was not primed and ready to deliver it. You spoke yourself of the human frailty that prevented one from taking all the factors into consideration. And you, in turn, or so it seems to me, leave out the biological factor, the very stuff out of which has been spun the fabric of all the arts, the warp and the woof of all human actions and achievements. To Ruth's amazement, Martin was not immediately crushed, and that the professor replied in the way he did struck her as forbearance for Martin's youth. Professor Caldwell sat for a full minute, silent and fingering his watch chain. "Do you know," he said at last, "I've had the same criticism passed on me once before, by a very great man, a scientist and evolutionist, Joseph LeConte. But he is dead, and I thought to remain undetected. And now you come along and expose me. Seriously, though, and this is confession, I think there is something in your contention, a great deal, in fact. I am too classical, not enough up to date in the interpretive branches of science, and I can only plead the disadvantages of my education and a temperamental slothfulness that prevents me from doing the work. I wonder if you'll believe that I've never been inside a physics or chemistry laboratory. It is true, nevertheless. Leconte was right, and so are you, Mr. Eden, at least to an extent. How much I do not know. Ruth drew Martin away with her on a pretext, when she had got him aside, whispering, "You shouldn't have monopolized Professor Caldwell like that. There may be others who want to talk with him." "My mistake," Martin admitted contritely. "But I'd got him stirred up, and he was so interesting that I did not think. Do you know, he is the brightest, the most intellectual man I have ever talked with. And I'll tell you something else. I once thought that everybody who went to universities, or who sat in the high places in society, was just as brilliant and intelligent as he." "He's an exception," she answered. "I should say so. Whom do you want me to talk to now? Oh, say, bring me up against that cashier fellow." Martin talked for 15 minutes with him, nor could Ruth have wished better behaviour on her lover's part. Not once did his eyes flash, nor his cheeks flush, while the calmness and poise with which he talked surprised her. But in Martin's estimation, the whole tribe of bank cashiers fell a few 100%, and for the rest of the evening he laboured under the impression that bank cashiers and talkers of platitudes were synonymous phrases. The army officer he found good-natured and simple, a healthy, wholesome young fellow, content to occupy the place in life into which birth and luck had flung him. On learning that he had completed 2 years in the university, Martin was puzzled to know where he had stored it away. Nevertheless, Martin liked him better than the platitudinous bank cashier. "I really don't object to platitudes," he told Ruth later, "but what worries me into nervousness is the pompous, smugly complacent, superior certitude with which they are uttered, and the time taken to do it. Why, I could give that man the whole history of the Reformation in the time he took to tell me that the Union Labour Party had fused with the Democrats. Do you know, he skins his words as a professional poker player skins the cards that are dealt out to him. Some day I'll show you what I mean." "I'm sorry you don't like him," was her reply. "He's a favourite of Mr. Butler's. Mr. Butler says he is safe and honest, calls him the Rock, Peter, and says that upon him any banking institution can be well built.